Hi, welcome to week 2 of our Intellectual Honesty Challenge for this Easter 2017. This week we'll be looking at a report from Eyewitness Agnostic number 2. The question we're asking each week is Jesus a fraud, or is indeed he the Son of God? And that hinges upon one historical event, as we talked about, and that event is the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Did it happen? Did it not? And we're looking at eyewitness reports. We'll be looking at 5 of those altogether. John was the apostle who wrote the Gospel of John, and my encouragement to you is to read that book for yourself. Read the eyewitness reports for yourself, regardless of where you stand on the issues. Because the Easter message hinges, and the Christian message, the gospel, the good news, hinges all upon one single event: the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. Today's witness is witness number 1. I call him Agnostic number 1, a person with sincere doubts. He had been a theist, but his faith had failed him. He was unimpressed by the emotional appeals of his friends because he knew the facts. I found a few photos that I thought made me think of how this person probably felt. I won't get fooled again. I once believed, but no more. You know, he had once believed intently. Now his doubts actually defined who he was. His doubts had begun to define him to the point that his first name for 2 millennia has now become associated with doubt. I thought the little button in the corner was cute. Thank God I'm an agnostic. Thomas is our fellow. He not only doubted, but he wasn't even sure if he cared anymore. So again, I kind of let you know, who's agnostic number 1? Whose name became synonymous with doubting the gospel and Christ? Well, we call him sometimes Doubting Thomas. He had been one of Jesus' own 12 disciples. Did he really become an agnostic? Did he really doubt to that point? Well, look at the story for yourself. Reading from the Gospel of John, which is, I hope, where you're reading now, between now and Easter, says, "But Thomas, sometimes called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples," and this is speaking of after Jesus' death and burial, said, "We have seen the Master." But he, Thomas, said, and here's his line, "Unless I see the nail hole in his hand, put my finger in the nail holes and stick my hand in his side, I won't believe it." I would say Thomas was pretty convinced he was not a believer anymore. Now, does Thomas describe how you feel those genuine doubts, perhaps, or for someone that you know? Has doubt become your first name? Can you relate to perhaps how he felt? I'm theorizing, but I'm guessing Thomas felt things like, you know, what I once believed in was a lie. I'm disappointed that I believed. I feel kind of foolish. I feel ashamed for following that. I'm disappointed with God, if there is a God. You know, from this day on, I'm not trusting anybody. Thomas felt like a fool. And you know, for good reason, because he knew the facts. There was no emotion or excitement from any of his friends that was going to convince him of anything to the contrary. Jesus was dead. Question is, are your doubts sincere? Are you just content with doubt, or do you really want to know for sure? You know, I think of the t-shirt kind of describes what Thomas would have worn. I won't be fooled again. I won't get fooled again. The thing about Thomas' doubt that's different than some people was his doubt was sincere. It was not just a chip on his shoulder so that he could live the way he wanted to. He wasn't trying to point out, well, everybody else is a hypocrite, so I'm not going to believe it. No, he was really willing to follow the truth where he led. His doubt just needed some answers. The question for you is, are you willing to follow the truth where it leads? Or is doubt simply just perhaps a convenient excuse? Are you searching in the right place to find the truth? It's hard to find the truth unless you're in the right place. And my challenge to you is that right place between now and Easter is by reading the Gospel of John. Well, Thomas sought the truth and he found it. John 20 tells us, 8 days later, Jesus' disciples were again in the room. This time Thomas was with them. Jesus came through the locked doors, stood among them, and said, "Peace be to you." Now, assuming Jesus did this, as the eyewitnesses report, had I have been Jesus, I probably would have scolded Thomas. "What do you mean for doubting me? You knew me, you were with me. Why did you?" Jesus didn't do that. Jesus simply said to Thomas, "Reach here your fingers, see my hands. Reach here your hand, put it in my side, and don't be believing, but believing." Thomas' response, he answered and said, "My Lord and my God." Thomas' doubts were answered. It comes back to the heart intent of doubt. Because God gives enough factual information, enough factual evidence for those who seek truth, yet he leaves enough mystery for those who really choose to disbelieve and reject the truth that they know. That's because he wants us to respond in faith and in obedience. And as I mentioned, Jesus didn't reprimand Thomas for those doubts, but instead he gave him the additional truth that he needed to follow. So did finding the truth make any difference? That's the real question. If I knew the truth, would it make any difference? It did in Thomas' life. No one would really die for something they knew to be a lie. People will put up a pretty good show, but when it comes down to being killed, if you really know it's a lie, you won't die for it. What happened to Thomas? Well, tradition and history both tell us that doubting Thomas, who's no longer a doubter, was convinced enough that he carried the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ and salvation, to southern India. How convinced was he? Well, he was a bold witness to the point that he was eventually martyred. He was speared to death, tradition tells us, by Hindu priests of their god Kali, and that reportedly happened on December 21st, 70 AD, near Madras, India. How about you? Are you accepting the challenge? Read the Gospel of John between now and Easter. And I hope you'll join me next week for Eyewitness Account of Agnostic number 2. We're going to look at someone this time who wasn't plagued by doubt, but instead someone who was hardened by life. He didn't know and he didn't even care. But my question to you each week, or my statement, is that the only reason to believe the gospel is because it's true. And are you open and minded enough to read the Gospel of John for yourself? I hope you will, and I hope you'll be back next week for Agnostic number 2. Hardened by life, and I don't know, and I don't care. Have a good week.